The floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand penthouse overlooked a city that Marcus Thorne believed he finally owned. Inside, 100 of the city's most influential power players stood on polished marble, their laughter as sharp as the diamonds on their wrists. Marcus stood in the center of the room, adjusting his silk cufflinks and checking his phone. Marcus wasn't nervous about the launch of his new architectural firm. He was excited about the entertainment. Specifically, the woman he had lured here to stand in the corner and watch him succeed where she had failed. A woman who, in his mind, was a ghost of a past that no longer matched his polished future. The woman he had spent years making feel small so he could feel tall. That woman was Zariah Storm. She was the architect who had designed half of Marcus's portfolio while he took the credit, the woman he'd discarded the moment his career took flight because she didn't have the look for the elite circles he craved. He had told her that her natural, curly hair was distracting in boardrooms and that her simple elegance was understated to a fault. Zariah hadn't fought him. When he broke her heart, she simply gathered her blueprints, left his penthouse, and vanished into her work. But that was 2 years ago. Tonight, Marcus was celebrating a partnership with the city's top real estate moguls. It was the perfect transactional move, one that would cement his image as the new king of the skyline. But the way Zariah had walked away without a tear still grated on Marcus's ego. He couldn't stand that she wasn't begging for his help. So, he did something malicious. He sent her a VIP invitation to his gala of success with a handwritten note tucked inside. Come see the level you'll never reach. I'm building a world you don't belong in. What Marcus didn't know was that while Zariah was working in the shadows, she had caught the eye of the man who owned the shadows. His name was Yoo Tae-hwan. The public knew him as a reclusive billionaire investor. His enemies knew him as the Iron Ghost, a mafia boss who ran an empire with cold, surgical precision. He had one rule: never let a woman become a weakness. He had broken that rule the moment he saw Zariah Storm's sketches. For the past 6 months, he had been quietly, intensely fascinated by her, not just her talent, but her quiet strength. Zariah hadn't told him about Marcus's invitation, she had hidden it under a pile of mail. But Tae-hwan had people who saw everything, people who brought him the names of anyone who dared to breathe a word of disrespect toward the woman he protected. So when Zariah stepped into that penthouse tonight in a simple cream dress, intending to face her past and finally close the door on Marcus Thorne, she had no idea that Tae-hwan's black SUV was already idling at the curb. She had no idea that the king of the skyline was about to meet the man who owned the ground he stood on. Marcus Thorne was about to learn that some rules are meant to be broken, especially when you disrespect the woman who matters to the most dangerous man in the city. The fluorescent lights of the architectural firm always seemed to hum at a frequency that specifically targeted Zariah's migraines. It was 3 years ago, but in her mind, the memory was as sharp as a fresh X-Acto blade. She sat at her drafting table, her fingers stained with graphite, staring at the blueprints for the Thorne Plaza. They were her designs, every cantilevered balcony and energy-efficient atrium had been birthed from her late nights and skipped meals. But the name on the title block was Marcus Thorne. Zariah had learned early on that in this industry, a black woman's brilliance was often treated like a hidden foundation, necessary to keep the building standing, but never meant to be seen by the public. She watched through the glass walls of the executive lounge as Marcus laughed with the senior partners, his hand resting familiarly on a mahogany table she wasn't allowed to sit at. He looked like the future of architecture. She looked like the help that drew it. When Marcus finally emerged, he didn't offer a thank you. He offered a critique of her appearance instead. "You're working the fundraiser tonight, Zariah," he said, not asking but commanding. "But do something about the hair. It's a bit much for the donors. We need sleek. We need corporate." She felt the familiar sting of his words, a microaggression wrapped in a career advice. She reached up to touch her curls, wondering when the way her hair grew out of her head had become a professional liability. She didn't know then that this was the last time she would ever let a man tell her how to exist. The fundraiser was a sea of beige and navy blue, a world of old money that looked at Zariah like she was the catering staff even when she held the master plans in her hand. Marcus spent the evening pivoting away from her every time a major investor approached. He was a chameleon, blending into the high society background, while she felt like a neon sign of otherness. During the silent auction, she overheard a group of board members discussing the Thorne Plaza. "Marcus is a visionary," one said. "A true talent." Zariah stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Actually," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "the structural integrity of the North Wing was achieved through a unique cross-bracing system I developed." The man didn't even turn around. He simply looked over her shoulder for a waiter. Marcus appeared out of the shadows, placing a firm, bruising hand on Zariah's arm and pulling her toward the coat closet. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his eyes darting around to see if anyone had noticed her speaking. "I told you to stay in the background. You're the back end of this operation, Zariah. You don't have the social currency for this. You're just too plain. You don't fit the image I'm building." He was erasing her in real time, and she could feel her own identity beginning to fade. The ride back to the penthouse they shared was silent. Zariah watched the city lights blur past the window of the Uber, realizing that she had been an architect of her own prison. She had built Marcus's world, floor by floor, while he tore hers down to the studs. When they reached the top floor, Marcus didn't wait for her. He walked to the center of the living room, pouring himself a scotch that cost more than her monthly rent. "I think it's best if you move out by the weekend," he said casually, swiveling the ice in his glass. "I'm moving into a different tier now, Zariah. The partners want me to start dating someone from the Kim family. It's a strategic alignment. You're great at the math, but you're not a queen. You're just a girl from the South Side who got lucky." The cruelty was so clinical it almost didn't feel real. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had supported through his licensing exams while she worked 2 jobs, and saw a stranger. He didn't see a partner, he saw a placeholder. "You're discarding me like a rough draft," she whispered. "I'm optimizing," he corrected. She realized then that Marcus wasn't just breaking her heart, he was trying to steal her future. Zariah didn't cry. The tears were there, hot and heavy behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She walked into the bedroom and grabbed the vintage leather suitcase her grandmother had given her. She didn't take the clothes he had bought her, the corporate dresses that felt like costumes. She took her tools, her sketches, and her pride. As she walked toward the elevator, Marcus called out from the sofa, his voice dripping with mock pity. "Good luck, Zariah. But remember, without my name on your resume, you're just another girl with a sketchbook. You'll never be invited back to a room like this." The elevator door slid shut on his smug face. As the car descended, Zariah felt the weight of 5 years of not belonging begin to lift. She stepped out into the cool night air, the South Side grit meeting her shoes. She was homeless, she was jobless, and she was alone in a city that had been taught to ignore her. But as she looked up at the skyline, she didn't see buildings she couldn't enter. She saw a canvas she was finally going to paint on her own terms. She was officially an outsider, but she was about to catch the eye of a man who ruled the outside. Yoo Tae-hwan lived by a code of absolute silence and surgical precision. In the underworld of the city, his name was spoken in whispers, usually followed by a sign of the cross. He sat in the back of a darkened Mercedes, the amber glow of the streetlights dancing across the sharp line of his jaw and the intricate black ink that climbed his neck like a warning. To the world, he was the ghost in the machine of high finance. To the streets, he was the man who decided who breathed and who bled. His life was built on the foundation of no attachments, a rule that had kept him alive for 34 years while his rivals ended up in the concrete footings of the bridges he financed. He didn't know that tonight, a single set of blueprints was about to dismantle his entire philosophy. Tae-hwan was currently reviewing the acquisition of a waterfront district, a multi-billion-dollar play that required the cooperation of every zoning official in the city. His lead associate, a man in a navy blue suit known as Shin, handed him a file. Usually, these files contained the price tag for a politician's soul or the gambling debts of a city planner. But this time, it was different. It was a rejection letter. A small, independent design firm had refused to adjust the environmental impact reports for the project, despite a bribe that would have retired a family for 3 generations. "Who owns this firm?" Tae-hwan asked, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that filled the car. "A woman named Zariah Storm," Shin replied, his voice cautious. "She's a freelancer working out of a studio in the South Side. She said the integrity of the structure was more important than the weight of our envelopes." Tae-hwan felt a rare spark of curiosity, a dangerous emotion for a man in his position. 2 nights later, Tae-hwan found himself standing in the shadows of a rain-slicked alleyway across from a small, dimly lit studio. He was a man who moved with a pack of security, yet here he was, alone, watching through a window. Inside, Zariah Storm was hunched over a drafting table. The light of a single desk lamp illuminated the gold of her skin and the focused intensity in her eyes. She wasn't looking for a payday, she was looking for perfection. He watched as she erased a line and redrew it, her movements fluid and rhythmic. She looked like she belonged to a world of creation, while he was the king of destruction. He had meant to stay for 5 minutes to size up an adversary. He stayed for 3 hours. He watched her drink cold coffee, saw her rub the back of her neck in exhaustion, and noticed the way she looked at a photograph of a building she had clearly designed but wasn't allowed to claim. There was a hunger in her that he recognized, not for money, but for justice. As she finally turned off the light, Tae-hwan realized he had forgotten to check his watch for the first time in a decade. The next week, the pressure on Zariah intensified. Tae-hwan's associates were not used to being told no. He sat in his penthouse, watching a security feed of his men approaching her office to persuade her. He saw Zariah stand in the doorway, a woman in a simple cream sweater facing down 3 men who had killed for less than a parking spot. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She told them that if they wanted her signature, they would have to earn it by making the building safe for the people who would live in it. Tae-hwan watched the screen, his fingers tracing the scars on his knuckles. He should have given the order to clear the obstacle. He should have treated her like any other variable in a transaction. But when his lead enforcer raised a hand to intimidate her, Tae-hwan felt a surge of cold fury that had nothing to do with business. He picked up his phone and spoke one word: "Stand down." His men retreated, confused, and for the first time, his inner circle began to whisper that the Iron Ghost was softening. He began to collect her history like a predator gathering scent. He learned about Marcus Thorne, the man who had stolen her light and tried to bury her in the shadows. He saw the invitations Marcus had sent, the petty insults, and the way the architectural world had closed its doors to her to please a man with a louder voice and a shallower soul. Tae-hwan found himself sitting in his office, ignored documents piled high, staring at a picture of Zariah at a bus stop. She looked tired, but her shoulders were square. He had broken his rule of silence to protect her projects. He had broken his rule of anonymity to ensure her contracts were secretly funded. And now, as he held the invitation to Marcus Thorne's final humiliation gala in his hand, the same invitation his people had intercepted, Tae-hwan felt the last of his cold logic slip away. "Shin," Tae-hwan called out, his eyes fixed on the city skyline. "Find out who tailored the suit I wore to the Tokyo summit. And tell the red dress she's coordinated with the blue suit for a public appearance." "Sir?" Shin asked, stunned. "You never go to galas. You never go to the light." Tae-hwan stood up, the tattoos on his hands flexed as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Tonight, the light is going to learn that it only exists because the shadows allow it." Yoo Tae-hwan was officially breaking every rule he had ever lived by, and he was doing it for a woman who didn't even know his name. The digital clocks on the wall of Tae-hwan's private study hummed with a quiet, persistent rhythm, synchronized to the heartbeats of financial markets across the globe. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, the dark surface reflecting the glow of several monitors. His attention, however, wasn't on the fluctuating stock prices or the intercepted communications of rival syndicates. Instead, it was focused on a single piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock that sat in the center of his desk, the invitation to Marcus Thorne's gala. To anyone else, it was a social engagement. To Tae-hwan, it was a crime scene in the making. Shin stood at the edge of the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his navy blue suit impeccably pressed. He cleared his throat, a sound that usually signaled a report of high-stakes business, but today, his eyes held a flicker of genuine concern. He had spent the morning digging into the internal communications of Thorne's firm. "It's worse than we thought, sir," Shin began, his voice dropping an octave. "Thorne isn't just inviting Zariah Storm to see his success. He's prepared a presentation for the board. He intends to use her early conceptual sketches, the ones he claimed as his own, as examples of amateur work that he saved with his own expertise. He's going to frame her as a cautionary tale of a failed hire in front of every major developer in the city." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Tae-hwan didn't move. He didn't blink. But the ink on his neck seemed to darken as the muscles tightened. He reached out, his tattooed thumb tracing the raised gold lettering of Marcus Thorne's name on the invitation. For years, Tae-hwan had operated on the principle that people were either assets or liabilities, nothing more. Emotions were variables that led to mistakes, and mistakes led to the morgue. But hearing the calculated, petty cruelty Marcus had planned for Zariah felt like a personal insult to the order of the world. "He's making a mockery of the one thing she values," Tae-hwan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Her integrity. He thinks because she has no one to stand for her, she is a target for his sport." "Thorne is a social climber, sir," Shin added, stepping closer. "He believes that by stepping on her, he'll look taller to the men in the background. He's already told the catering staff to treat her like a stray who wandered in. He wants her to feel every inch of the exclusion he's designed for her." Tae-hwan's grip on the desk tightened until the obsidian began to groan under the pressure. The red dress. The woman known as Kim, Tae-hwan's most trusted intelligence operative, entered the room, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. She held a tablet, her expression uncharacteristically grim. "I've finished the deep dive into Thorne's offshore accounts," she said, sliding the tablet onto the desk. "The man is a house of cards. He's been embezzling from the development fund to maintain the lifestyle he thinks he deserves. He's leveraged the very building the gala is being held in against a debt he can't pay. He's desperate, and Zariah is the scapegoat he needs to distract the board from his own rotting foundations." Tae-hwan looked at the data. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a bully, he was a fraud. A parasite living off the brilliance of a woman he had tried to destroy. The rule of no attachments screamed in the back of Tae-hwan's mind, reminding him that he had no business interfering in the petty squabbles of a failing architect. He should let the man drown in his own debt. But then he saw a recent photo of Zariah, caught by a surveillance camera as she left a grocery store. She looked tired. She looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet her head was held high. He realized then that he wasn't just breaking his rule. He was burning the rulebook. He stood up slowly, the movement fluid and predatory. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that bowed to him. The lights below looked like fallen stars, but his focus was on the distant silhouette of the Thorne penthouse. He thought about the natural curls Marcus had called distracting, the simple elegance he had called plain, and the brilliance he had tried to bury. "Sir," Shin whispered, sensing the shift in the air. "The Japanese delegation is expecting you at the warehouse tonight for the final shipment audit. It's a $40 million transaction. You cannot be seen in public, especially not at a high society event. It would expose everything we've built." Tae-hwan didn't turn around. He watched his own reflection in the glass, the face of a man who had never allowed himself to want anything he couldn't take by force. But he didn't want to take Zariah Storm. He wanted to avenge her. He wanted to be the Storm that Marcus Thorne never saw coming. "The shipment can wait," Tae-hwan said. The gravity of his voice made the associates in the room go still. He reached for his jacket, the fabric slipping over his shoulders like armor. He adjusted his white shirt, the collar crisp against the ink on his neck. "Sir?" Kim asked, her eyes wide. "What are you doing?" Tae-hwan turned, his steady gaze directed forward, one hand sliding into his pocket with a calm, dominant demeanor that signaled the end of a long peace. The Iron Ghost was stepping into the light, and the city would never be the same. "Change my schedule," Tae-hwan uttered, the words cold and final. "I'm going to a party." The hunters were about to become the prey, and Marcus Thorne had no idea the doors were already locking. The humidity of the Chicago evening clung to the glass exterior of the Thorne Tower, but inside the lobby, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelled of expensive lilies and desperation. Zariah stood before the mirrored elevator doors, adjusting the hem of her cream-colored dress. It was a simple silk slip, modest in its V-neckline but elegant in the way it draped over her curves. She had chosen it because it felt like her, understated, grounded, and real. But as a group of women in stiff taffeta and architectural headpieces glided past her, their eyes raking over her natural curls with a mixture of pity and disdain, Zariah felt the old familiar knot tighten in her chest. She wasn't just an attendee, she was a ghost returning to a house that had tried to bury her. She gripped her small clutch, her knuckles as white as the silk of her dress. She reminded herself that she was here for closure, to prove to the woman in the mirror that Marcus Thorne no longer held the keys to her self-worth. But as the elevator began its smooth, silent ascent to the penthouse, the silence felt heavy, pressing against her eardrums. She was walking into a lion's den with nothing but her dignity as armor, and for a fleeting second, she wondered if dignity would be enough to survive the night. The elevator dings, and she realizes there is no turning back now. The doors slid open to reveal a world of blinding light and choreographed opulence. The penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and steel, the very building she had spent a year designing in the dark while Marcus slept. Now, it was filled with the city's elite, people who sipped vintage champagne and spoke in the clipped, rapid tones of those who bought and sold lives for breakfast. Zariah stepped onto the marble floor, her heels clicking softly, a rhythmic contrast to the booming laughter of men in charcoal suits. She saw Marcus immediately. He was at the far end of the room, standing under a crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion, surrounded by a semicircle of admirers. He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers, and a slow, predatory smirk spread across his face. He didn't come to greet her. Instead, he leaned into the ear of the woman next to him. The heiress Rachel Kim, and whispered something that made them both look at Zariah and laugh. The sound was like glass breaking in Zariah's ears. She took a step toward the bar, her breath hitching. Every conversation she passed seemed to lower in volume, the socialites whispering about the plus one who didn't seem to have a plus. She felt small. She felt like the plain girl Marcus had accused her of being, a smudge of charcoal on a pristine white canvas. She reaches for a glass of water, her hand trembling just enough for the light to catch the movement. She moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights to avoid the judgmental stares. The height was dizzying. She had built this view, yet she felt like she was falling through it. The isolation was suffocating, she was surrounded by 100 people, yet she had never felt more alone in her life. She could hear Marcus's voice rising over the music as he began to lead the board members toward the digital display where her stolen work was being projected. He was preparing the stage for her public execution, his chest puffed out with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Zariah closed her eyes, praying for the strength to keep her head up, to not let them see her crumble. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sudden noise, but rather a sudden silence that started at the entrance and rippled inward like a cold front. The air grew dense, charged with a sudden, electric tension that made the hair on the back of Zariah's neck stand up. The mocking whispers died out, replaced by a low, respectful murmur. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. Something has entered the room that doesn't belong to the world of polished lies. Zariah felt it before she saw it. A heavy, protective presence materialized directly behind her, so close she could feel the radiating warmth of a broad chest against her back. It was a physical weight, an invisible shield that seemed to block out the cold drafts of the penthouse. The scent of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something metallic, like the air before a lightning strike, enveloped her. For the first time all night, the shaking in her hands stopped. She didn't have to turn around to know that the predator in the room had just met something much higher on the food chain. The crowd in front of her parted like the Red Sea. Their faces, once filled with smug derision, were now masked with a mixture of confusion and genuine fear. Marcus, mid-sentence and mid-boast, froze. His champagne glass stayed frozen at his lips, his eyes widening as he looked past Zariah at the figure standing over her shoulder. The power in the room had vanished from Marcus's hands in a single heartbeat, sucked toward the man standing in Zariah's shadow. Zariah slowly turned, her breath catching in her throat. Standing there was a man in a black suit so sharp it looked dangerous. His dark hair was perfectly styled, but it was the ink on his neck, dark, intricate, and unapologetic, that marked him as a king from a different world. His expression was a mask of controlled, terrifying calm, his gaze directed not at the room, but downward, at her. One of his hands was in his pocket, relaxed and dominant, while the other moved almost imperceptibly as if to steady her. She looks into the eyes of Yoo Tae-hwan, and for the first time in years, she feels completely safe. The silence following Tae-hwan's entrance was so thick it felt like the pressure in the cabin of an airplane right before the door is ripped open. He didn't say a word to the room, he simply looked at Zariah, his eyes searching hers for a fraction of a second to ensure she was still holding together. The heat from his presence was a physical wall, separating Zariah from the cold, judgmental glares of the elite. But Marcus Thorne, driven by a cocktail of champagne and desperate ego, couldn't let the spotlight stay on anyone else for long. He cleared his throat, the sound grating against the sudden stillness. "Well," Marcus said, his voice forced and unnaturally bright as he stepped toward the podium. "It seems we have some late arrivals. But let's not let the distractions take away from why we're all here. Tonight isn't just about my success, it's about the journey. And every journey has its, let's call them learning curves." Marcus grabs the microphone, the feedback whine echoing like a predator's cry. He tapped the screen behind him, and a high-resolution projector hummed to life. Zariah's heart plummeted. On the massive digital display appeared a series of her early sketches, blueprints for a community center she had designed with her soul. But they had been altered. Red digital ink slashed across her elegant curves, and the text beneath them labeled the work as structurally unsound and conceptually naive. "When I first took Zariah under my wing," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with a faux paternal sympathy that made Zariah's stomach churn, "I saw potential. But as you can see from these early drafts, there's a difference between a hobbyist with a sketchbook and a professional who understands the skyline. I kept these as a reminder of where we started, and why I had to eventually make the difficult choice to move the firm in a more sophisticated direction." The room erupted into polite, cruel snickers. Rachel Kim leaned back against a marble pillar, her eyes fixed on Zariah with the smug satisfaction of a woman watching a bug being pinned to a board. Zariah looks at the screen, seeing her life's work being twisted into a joke. "I invited Zariah tonight because I believe in second chances," Marcus lied, his smile widening as he saw her flinch. "I wanted her to see what happens when you stop playing at architecture and start commanding it. It's hard for some people to accept that they just don't belong in the room where it happens. It's not a matter of effort, it's a matter of pedigree." He was looking directly at her now, his eyes mocking her cream dress, her natural hair, and the very fact that she dared to breathe the same air-conditioned atmosphere as his board members. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing her shoulders down. She felt the urge to turn and run, to disappear back into the south side and never look at a blueprint again. But then, the heavy, warm hand that had been hovering near her back moved. Tae-hwan didn't touch her, not yet, but he leaned down, his lips inches from her ear, his voice a low, vibrating chord that only she could hear. "Don't look at the screen," he whispered. "Look at me." Zariah lifts her chin, her gaze locking onto the cold, dark depths of Tae-hwan's eyes. Tae-hwan's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something molten behind his calm mask. He was watching Marcus the way a scientist watches a specimen under a microscope right before the acid is applied. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black remote that certainly didn't belong to the penthouse's AV system. Marcus was still talking, his voice rising in a crescendo of self-congratulation. And so, as we look toward the future of Thorne Plaza, we leave the amateur hour behind us. We move forward with. The screen behind Marcus flickered. The distorted sketches of Zariah's work vanished, replaced by a scrolling ledger of bank accounts, offshore transfers, and a series of high-definition photos of Marcus Thorne meeting with a known city official in a dark parking garage. The room went from whispering to a deathly, suffocating silence. "What is this?" Marcus stammered, spinning around. "Turn it off. Someone turn this off." The screen freezes on a document titled Thorne Plaza, Fraudulent Structural Certifications. Tae-hwan finally moved. He stepped out from Zariah's side, walking slowly into the center of the room. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply moved with the terrifying grace of a man who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. His shadows, the man in the blue suit and the woman in the red dress, moved into position at the exits, their faces as hard as granite. Marcus backed away from the podium, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The microphone, still in his shaking hand, picked up the sound of his ragged breathing. "You talk a lot about pedigree, Marcus," Tae-hwan said, his voice projected with a natural authority that made the speakers tremble. "But you forgot the first rule of the skyline. You never build your house on a foundation of stolen dreams. Especially not when those dreams belong to someone under my protection." The Iron Ghost had spoken, and for the first time in his life, Marcus Thorne realized that the woman who wasn't supposed to matter was the only thing currently keeping him from the abyss. Tae-hwan stops 3 feet from Marcus, his eyes turning into shards of black ice. The heavy double doors of the penthouse didn't just open. They were thrown wide by 2 men whose presence felt like a physical intrusion of reality into a room full of silk and lies. The sudden draft of cold, night air from the hallway cut through the scent of expensive perfume, and as if a conductor had lowered a baton, every voice in the room died at once. Marcus, still standing at the podium with a smug grin directed at Zariah's downturned head, felt the air vanish from his lungs. The city's most elite board members, people who usually looked down on the world from their ivory towers, instinctively stepped back, creating a wide, fearful path toward the center of the room. Walking through that corridor of stunned silence was Yoo Tae-hwan. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, his black suit absorbing the light of the crystal chandeliers. To the socialites, he was a myth of the underworld. To the businessmen, he was the man who held their debts in his scarred hands. His eyes, dark and focused as a winter storm, never once flickered toward Marcus or the giant screen displaying Zariah's failures. He walked with a singular, unwavering purpose, his 3 associates trailing behind him like shadows of a coming storm. The silence is so absolute that the only sound is the rhythmic, heavy click of Tae-hwan's boots on the marble floor. Zariah stood frozen, her fingers still trembling against the fabric of her cream dress. She felt the gaze of 100 people shifting from mocking derision to paralyzed confusion. She expected the man to walk past her, to take the stage or demand a meeting with the moguls. Instead, the Iron Ghost stopped exactly 3 feet in front of her. The heat radiating from him was a shock to her system, a wall of protective intensity that made the rest of the room fade into a blur of meaningless faces. For a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. Then, the man who never showed weakness, the man who ruled by fear and cold logic, did something that shattered the social hierarchy of the room. He didn't speak to the board, he didn't acknowledge the elite. Yoo Tae-hwan placed a hand over his heart and performed a slow, deep, and profoundly respectful bow to Zariah Storm. It wasn't a gesture of social politeness, it was an act of fealty. As he rises from the bow, the ink on his neck catches the light, and the room realizes he isn't here to join the party, he's here to claim it. I apologize for my lateness, Zariah Tae-hwan said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried to every corner of the silent penthouse. He didn't look at Marcus, who was now gripping the podium so hard his knuckles were white. The traffic was heavy, and I had to stop to finish a transaction regarding this very building. I wanted to be here before the entertainment began. He reached out, his hand steady and large, and gently took Zariah's cold hand in his. The contact was electric, a grounded current that traveled up her arm and settled the frantic beating of her heart. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, pulling her close enough that she could feel the solid strength of him. The message was unmistakable, she was no longer an outsider looking in. She was the center of his world, and therefore, the center of theirs. Marcus tries to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound comes out. Tae-hwan finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowd like a scythe. When his eyes landed on Marcus, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The mock sympathy Marcus had been projecting only moments ago was replaced by a visible, trembling terror. The board members began to murmur, their loyalties shifting like sand as they realized the woman they had just been laughing at was now anchored to the most dangerous man in the country. You were saying something about pedigree, Mr. Thorne? Tae-hwan asked, his voice dripping with a lethal, quiet curiosity. He stepped forward, taking Zariah with him, forcing Marcus to shrink back against the digital display. You were explaining to these fine people why the genius behind the Thorne Plaza, the woman who actually drew the bones of this structure, doesn't belong in it? Tae-hwan signaled to the man in the blue suit, who stepped forward and handed him a sleek, black leather folder. The Iron Ghost didn't look at the folder, he kept his eyes locked on Marcus, who was now sweating through his $1,000 tuxedo. The room held its breath, sensing that the final humiliation Marcus had planned was about to be turned into a public execution of his own making. Tae-hwan flips the folder open, and the first page reveals the deed to the penthouse they are standing in, and the name on the owner's line isn't Marcus Thorne. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just respectful, it was suffocating. Tae-hwan stood in the center of the marble floor, his presence so massive that Marcus seemed to be shrinking into the very podium he had used as a throne. Tae-hwan didn't rush. He reached into the black leather folder held by his associate and pulled out a single, heavy sheet of vellum. He held it up just long enough for the front-row investors to see the gold seal of the city's land registry. You spent the last hour talking about your building, Marcus, Tae-hwan said, his voice a low, lethal silk. But a man of your pedigree should know that foundations built on debt are easily reclaimed. This morning, your primary creditors sold their interests. I didn't just buy the debt. I bought the ground, the steel, and the air you're currently breathing. Marcus's face went from pale to a translucent, sickly white. He looked at the paper, then at the board members, but they were all looking at the floor. The Iron Ghost had just walked into his house and revealed that he was actually the landlord. The realization that he is standing on someone else's property makes Marcus's knees visibly buckle. Tae-hwan didn't stop there. He pulled a second set of documents from the folder, a stack of legal termination notices stamped with the seal of the International Architectural Oversight Committee. He tossed them onto the podium. They slid across the polished wood and fanned out like a losing hand of cards. As the new owner of this development, Tae-hwan continued, his gaze sweeping over the stunned crowd, my first act is to dissolve the contract with Thorne Associates. Effective 5 minutes ago, your firm has been evicted from this project. You are banned from the premises, and your professional license is currently under review for the structural discrepancies we've so helpfully highlighted on that screen behind you. The room erupted into a frantic, low-frequency buzzing as the investors realized the man of the hour was now a man of nothing. Rachel Kim took a sharp step away from Marcus, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and calculation. She wasn't looking at her fiancé anymore, she was looking at the exit. The microphone in Marcus's hand emits a sharp, piercing squeal as his grip falters. You can't do this. Marcus finally choked out, his voice cracking. I built this. I am the face of this project. Zariah is just a freelancer, she's a nobody. You're throwing away the visionary for a girl who doesn't even have a firm. Tae-hwan's expression remained a mask of stone, but the grip he had on Zariah's hand tightened, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that grounded her. He turned slightly, looking down at Zariah with a gaze that was suddenly, shockingly warm. Then, he looked back at the room, his eyes turning back into shards of black ice. You're right about one thing, Marcus, Tae-hwan said, his voice vibrating with a power that made the champagne flutes on the nearby tables ring. She doesn't have a firm. Because as of tonight, she is the majority stakeholder in the new entity that will complete this skyline. From this moment forward, you don't speak to her as an ex-employee. You don't speak to her as a guest. Tae-hwan pauses, letting the weight of his next words settle over the crowd like a heavy shroud. He stepped forward, placing himself fully between Zariah and the man who had spent years trying to erase her. He looked at the board members, the socialites, and the shell of a man standing at the podium. You're speaking to my partner, Tae-hwan told the room, the words final and absolute. And in my world, disrespecting my partner is a debt that is always collected in full. Zariah felt the world shift on its axis. The label partner wasn't just about the building or the business. She could feel it in the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he had broken his own rules of shadow to stand in the light for her. She wasn't the girl in the cream dress standing in the corner anymore. She was the woman at the right hand of the most powerful man in the city. Marcus reached out, trying to grab the documents, trying to find some loophole in the reality that was collapsing around him. But Shin, the man in the blue suit, stepped forward with a cold, professional efficiency, blocking his path. Marcus looks at Zariah, hoping for a spark of the pity she used to have, but she only looks back with the eyes of a queen. The digital displays that had once held Marcus's stolen dreams now flickered with the cold, hard reality of his debts. The room, which had been his kingdom only 20 minutes prior, had become a cage. Marcus looked around the circle of investors and socialites, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single tether to the world he had sacrificed everything to enter. He looked at the chairman of the board, a man he had played golf with every Sunday for a year, but the older man simply turned his shoulder, engrossed in a sudden, urgent conversation with his wife. The social capital Marcus had painstakingly built wasn't just spent, it had been declared counterfeit. Chairman, please, Marcus stammered, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of its practiced baritone. There's been a mistake. The financing is it's a temporary restructuring. We can fix this. The chairman didn't even look back. I don't know you, Marcus. And I certainly don't know anyone who would treat a woman of Ms. Storm's caliber with such pathetic, amateurish spite. Don't call my office again. The sound of Marcus's name being erased from the guest list of the elite is more deafening than a gunshot. Tae-hwan didn't need to raise his voice to command the room's attention. He stood perfectly still, a pillar of dark shadow against the shimmering backdrop of the penthouse, his hand still firmly anchoring Zariah to his side. He signaled to the man in the white shirt, his most physically imposing associate, who began to walk toward the podium with the slow, inevitable pace of a closing cell door. Marcus backed away, his heels catching on the edge of the velvet rug, nearly tripping over the very microphone cord he had used to broadcast his insults. You're making a scene. Marcus hissed, though it was clear he was the only one causing a disturbance. This is a private event. You can't just throw me out of my own gala. It isn't your gala, Tae-hwan corrected, his tone as flat and sharp as a razor blade. And as of 60 seconds ago, you are trespassing on private property. The security you hired has already been replaced by men who take my orders. You are no longer the host, Marcus. You are the trash we are taking out before the real work begins. The associate reaches for Marcus's arm, and for a second, the room holds its breath to see if the visionary will fight or fold. Marcus folded. He tried to jerk away, but the grip of Tae-hwan's security was like iron. As he was led toward the elevator, he passed Rachel Kim. He reached out a hand, a desperate, silent plea for her to use her father's influence to stop the nightmare. Rachel didn't move an inch. She adjusted the strap of her designer gown and looked at him with a cold, clinical disgust that mirrored the way he had once looked at Zariah. "Stay away from me, Marcus," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire board to hear. "My father is already drafting the lawsuit for the fraudulent data you used to secure our engagement. You're lucky if you only end up in the street. I'd bet on a prison cell." The crowd parted for him, but not out of respect. They moved to avoid being touched by his failure. The people who had been laughing at his jokes and drinking his champagne moments ago now looked at him like he was a contagion. Marcus's face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror, the sweat pooling at his temples and ruining the corporate image he had traded his soul to maintain. The elevator doors chime, waiting to swallow the man who thought he was a king. Just before the associate pushed him into the car, Marcus twisted around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked at Zariah, who was standing tall, her natural curls framed by the city lights she had actually earned the right to design. "You think you've won?" he screamed, the sound echoing off the marble walls. "You're just trading one cage for another. He doesn't love you. You're just another acquisition to a man like him." Zariah didn't flinch. She didn't feel the sting of his words because, for the first time, she could see Marcus for exactly what he was, a small man who could only feel big by making others feel infinitesimal. She felt Tae-hwan's hand tighten on hers, a silent, steadying pulse of truth that drowned out Marcus's desperate lies. She didn't need to answer him. The silence of the room was her victory. The elevator door slid shut, cutting off Marcus's final, pathetic cry. The penthouse felt lighter, the air suddenly easier to breathe now that the rot had been removed. Tae-hwan turns to Zariah, and the coldness in his eyes vanishes, replaced by a terrifyingly intense focus that is for her alone. The penthouse was quiet now, the frantic energy of the gala having bled out with Marcus's departure. The elite guests remained, but they were no longer the predators, they were the audience, standing in hushed circles as they watched the new center of gravity. Zariah walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the same glass she had once looked at through the lens of Marcus's limitations. Below, the city was a sprawling tapestry of amber lights and silver veins, a labyrinth of concrete and steel that she had spent her life trying to navigate from the outside. But as she pressed her palm against the cool surface of the window, she realized the glass was no longer a barrier. She wasn't just looking at the skyline, she was looking at her future. The weight of the last few years. The whispered insults, the stolen credit, the suffocating fear that she was too plain for the world she loved, seemed to evaporate into the night air. She was Zariah Storm, and the building she stood in was no longer a monument to Marcus's ego. It was the first pillar of her own legacy. She feels a familiar, grounding warmth as a shadow falls across her shoulder. Tae-hwan stood beside her, his presence silent and absolute. He didn't look at the crowd, and he didn't look at the city. He looked only at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the skyline. He had spent his life in the shadows, moving pieces on a board that most people didn't even know existed, but for the first time, his no attachments rule felt like a relic of a man he no longer was. He had broken his code for her, and in doing so, he had found a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on fear, but on the fierce, protective need to see her light burn as bright as possible. "You're not an outsider anymore, Zariah," he said, his voice a low, private vibration that belonged only to the two of them. "You never were. You were just waiting for a stage large enough to hold the truth of what you are." He reached out, his tattooed hand coming to rest on the glass next to hers. The contrast was stark, the architect and the shadow, the creator and the protector, but the alignment was perfect. The room behind them holds its breath, sensing that the city's power has officially changed hands. Tae-hwan turned to the remaining board members, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the lingering tension. "The project continues," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a decree. "But the name Thorne is being struck from every record, every brick, and every beam. This building, and every development that follows, will bear the mark of the woman who actually had the vision to build them. Ms. Storm is the lead. My resources are her tools. If anyone has an objection, speak now so my associates can escort you to the elevator." No one spoke. The moguls and heiresses merely nodded, their eyes wide with a new, frantic respect. They didn't just see a woman in a cream dress, they saw the architect of a new empire. Zariah looked back at the city, her mind already racing with new designs. Buildings that didn't just scrape the sky but breathed with it, structures that celebrated the natural, the grounded, and the real. She thought of the South Side, of the girls who looked like her and were told their hair was distracting or their dreams were unrealistic. She would build something for them, too. She realizes that the crown she is wearing wasn't given to her, it was reclaimed. Tae-hwan leaned closer, his hand sliding from the glass to the small of her back, a gesture of quiet, dominant support. Marcus thought he was building a world you didn't belong in, he whispered, his eyes tracing the line of her profile. He was wrong. He was just clearing the space for you to build yours. He gestured to the vast, glittering expanse beyond the glass. The Chicago skyline was a forest of steel, but to Tae-hwan, it was merely raw material waiting for her touch. He wasn't just her protector, he was her patron, her partner, and the man who would burn down any world that tried to dim her. Look at it, Zariah, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate promise. Every block, every bridge, every spire. From tonight on, the city is yours to design. And I will be the shadow that ensures no one ever stands in your light again. Zariah leaned into him, the simple cream dress glowing against the dark fabric of his suit. She wasn't afraid of the heights anymore. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, standing at the right hand of the man who broke his rules for her, ready to redraw the world. The Iron Ghost has found his queen, and the skyline will never look the same.